When a librarian notices a phantom reef in her husband's multi-billion-dollar merger, she unlocks a secret that proves his corporate scam is just the surface of a generational conspiracy. Now, armed with only an antique map's hidden coordinates, she's being hunted by the very people who taught her husband how to lie. The first time I felt it, it was a cold, sharp clarity. Like looking through perfectly clean glass at something that shouldn't be there. I was stirring my morning coffee, the aroma of burnt sugar usually a comforting ritual. But that Tuesday, it smelled faintly of ash and ozone. My husband, Mark, was already dressed in his bespoke suit, radiating the easy confidence of a man who hadn't missed a target in a decade. "Morning, darling," he chirped, bending down to press a swift, dry kiss to my temple. "Big day. The final prospectus review before the acquisition goes live next week. Feels like Christmas came early, doesn't it? We're officially set for life." Mark was a high-flying venture capitalist, a shark in tailored wool. He lived for the thrill of the deal, the aggressive acquisition, the seven-figure win. I, on the other hand, was a librarian with a small side hustle, restoring antique maps, a profession that valued patience, precision, and the accumulated wisdom of centuries. Our lives were perfectly balanced, or so everyone thought. But lately, my internal barometer had been spinning wildly. It wasn't a dream or a vague feeling. It was a physical certainty that settled behind my sternum whenever Mark brought up Project Chimera. That was the internal code name for the massive leveraged buyout he was spearheading, the one that would double our net worth and secure our retirement by the time I turned 40. "Mark," I started, setting the mug down a little too hard. The ceramic clinked against the granite counter. "About Chimera. Are you absolutely sure about the due diligence on their overseas assets?" He paused, his hand hovering over the briefcase latch. He gave me that look, the one that blended amused tolerance with a faint, patronizing pity. It was the look he reserved for when I worried about the strange rattling sound in the attic or suggested we use organic fertilizer. "Honey, we've been over this," he sighed, adjusting his tie in the reflection of the stainless steel fridge. "It's solid. The projections are aggressive but sound. We've got the best analysts in the city looking at this. Why the sudden doubt? Did you read a bad article online?" "It's not an article," I insisted, stepping closer, my voice dropping to an urgent whisper. "It's a tightness. It feels wrong. Like looking at a map where the coastline doesn't match the historical record. There's a phantom reef, Mark, something they haven't disclosed." He laughed then, a booming, dismissive sound that always managed to shrink my concerns down to the size of a misplaced bookmark. "A phantom reef? Clara, this isn't high fantasy. This is a multi-billion-dollar corporate takeover. If there was a phantom reef, my team of MBAs would have surfaced it months ago. You need to relax. Maybe take a spa day. This stress is making you see sea monsters." He kissed me again, this time lingering just long enough to inject a dose of his usual charming confidence into my system, a kind of chemical reassurance that always worked on everyone but me. "I'll call you at lunch," he said, already heading for the door. "And stop worrying about my multi-million-dollar portfolio. I've got it locked down tighter than Fort Knox." The front door clicked shut. The silence he left behind was deafening, heavy with the scent of expensive cologne and impending disaster. I walked back to the counter, picked up my coffee, and stared out the window at the perfectly manicured lawn. The feeling didn't dissipate. If anything, it sharpened. It wasn't just wrong. It felt imminent. I walked over to the small antique globe in the corner of the living room, spinning it slowly, my fingertips tracing the lines of longitude and latitude. I had a desperate, inexplicable urge to check the records Mark had casually dismissed. I had to know what that phantom reef was, and I had a terrible feeling that by the time Mark finished his lunch meeting, it would be too late to do anything about it. I pulled out my laptop, my heart hammering against my ribs, and typed in the rarely used administrative login for Mark's encrypted shared drive, a login he'd given me years ago for emergencies, joking that the only emergency I'd ever use it for was checking if he'd remembered to pay the utility bill. But this time, the emergency was far, far greater than that, and as the screen blinked to life, displaying the familiar folder structure, I saw a new, highly restricted folder labeled simply Project Chimera, Final Signatures Pending. I clicked it, my hands shaking, expecting to see spreadsheets, but instead I saw a single, hastily uploaded PDF titled Offshore Shell Trust Audit, Preliminary Findings, Do Not Distribute. My breath caught in my throat as I realized the horrifying implication of those words. I clicked the file, praying it was just boring tax jargon, but what loaded onto the screen instead made the blood drain from my face. A detailed, heavily redacted chart showing massive, undisclosed liabilities funneling directly into a holding company registered in a country known only for its lax financial oversight. And at the bottom of the document, stamped in red, were the words, Imminent Insolvency Warning, Immediate Liquidation Recommended. I frantically scrolled down, trying to find the date of the report, when the page suddenly refreshed, displaying a new notification over the documents. It wasn't an internal memo. It was a system alert from an external source. SEC investigation initiated. All assets subject to immediate freezing in 48 hours. I felt a wave of nausea hit me. Mark wasn't just dealing with a bad investment, he was caught in the center of a federal crackdown. I looked at the timestamp on the SEC alert. It had been posted 5 minutes ago. I had minutes, maybe hours, before the whole empire collapsed and took our savings, our house, and Mark's freedom with it. I snatched my phone, my fingers flying to dial his office line. But before the first ring connected, my screen flashed with a notification from Mark's personal cell, a text message. It wasn't addressed to me. It was a reply to someone else, an acknowledgement of a large, untraceable transfer, and the message simply read, Funds secured. See you at the airport at 4 p.m. Don't tell Clara. The air in the room suddenly felt too thin, like I was breathing recycled oxygen in a sealed vault. Mark wasn't just oblivious, he was complicit. The cold, sharp clarity that had warned me about the phantom reef now solidified into a brutal, agonizing truth. He hadn't just dismissed my concerns, he had been actively moving assets to escape the inevitable crash. Don't tell Clara. The words burned into my mind, a final stinging betrayal delivered not by shouting, but by accidental digital evidence. My thumb froze over the call button. Calling him now would give him the warning he needed, the crucial window between the SEC investigation alert and the actual asset freeze. A window he was clearly planning to use to vanish with whatever money he could salvage, leaving me standing on the shore while his corporate ship sank. I stared at the text message, my mind racing through the logical constraints of our life. 4 p.m. It was barely 11:30 a.m. now. That gave me a little over 4 hours. He was planning to be at the airport, not the main international hub, but the smaller private airstrip 20 miles outside the city where his business associates often kept their jets. If he was transferring funds now, he was executing his exit strategy before the acquisition finalized next week. He was planning to gut the deal, blame the offshore structure, which he'd likely already fully controlled, and disappear, leaving the entire mess to explode on the public market and the federal investigators. I had to stop him, but confronting him directly was impossible. If he knew I'd accessed his drive, he'd panic, disappear immediately, and likely have some legal maneuver ready to shield his assets from me in the ensuing divorce or fraud investigation. I needed proof of his intent to abscond, not just the preliminary audit warning. I quickly navigated back to the shared drive, my fingers now moving with a frantic, learned speed. I bypassed the Shell Trust files and dove into the deeper layers of his communications logs, something I had never dared to touch before. Hidden beneath a cluster of outdated quarterly reports, I found an encrypted folder labeled Contingency. It took me 3 agonizing minutes to bypass the secondary password. A birthday, but not mine or his. It was the birthday of his former executive assistant, a woman who had abruptly quit 6 months ago after a very messy, very quiet separation. Inside Contingency, there were digital tickets. 2 first-class tickets on a private charter leaving that very private airstrip at 4 p.m., destination Buenos Aires. And next to the tickets, a short, heavily encrypted voice note. I clicked it, holding the phone away from my ear, leaning close to the tiny speaker. The voice on the recording was Mark's, stripped of its usual boardroom bravado. It was low, rushed, and colder than I'd ever heard him. The window closes before the news cycle catches up. The offshore funds are ready to be deployed once the freeze hits the main accounts. Tell Ricardo to meet me plainside with the final paperwork for the Cayman transfer. Once I'm on the ground, tell Clara, tell her I had to step away for a family emergency and that she shouldn't worry about the finances. Everything is insured. It's a clean break. A clean break. He wasn't just saving himself. He was writing me a polite note of abandonment while simultaneously planning to leave me to face federal fraud investigators who would trace every dollar back to our marital accounts. The betrayal was absolute. I closed the file, my heart now pounding a steady, furious rhythm. I couldn't call the SEC. They wouldn't act fast enough on a tip from an anonymous source referencing unconfirmed internal documents. I couldn't call the police. They'd see a domestic dispute over assets, not a major corporate flight risk. I had to get to the airport myself, and I had to bring Mark down before that plane took off. I glanced at the clock. 12:15 p.m. I had less than 4 hours. I needed evidence that was physical, undeniable, and accessible immediately upon his arrival at the airstrip. I ran to the hall closet, pulling out my dusty, rarely used emergency travel bag. I knew Mark kept a secondary burner phone, one he used only for sensitive communications outside his main network, hidden in the lining of his golf bag in the garage. It was the only device that might still hold verifiable evidence of the transfer codes he was planning to use in South America. I sprinted to the garage, my librarian calm utterly shattered, replaced by a desperate survivalist focus. I wrestled open the heavy golf bag, digging past the graphite shafts until my fingers hit the thin, hard outline of the burner phone tucked exactly where I suspected. I pulled it out. It was an old model, the kind that couldn't even connect to most modern apps, but it had one function Mark relied on: encrypted SMS for quick confirmations. I powered it on. The battery icon was flashing red, critically low. I immediately plugged it into the nearest external battery pack, my hands clumsy with haste. The phone took nearly 30 seconds to boot up, and as the home screen finally resolved, the low battery warning switched to a stark, flashing red screen of death. The screen went dark, completely dead. I stared at the inert black rectangle in my palm, paralyzed by the sheer crushing bad luck. I was seconds away from finding the final piece of evidence that could tie him to the fraud and stop him from boarding that plane, and the battery had chosen that exact moment to die. I scrambled for the charger cord, then realized the port on this burner phone was proprietary. I didn't have the right adapter in the house. Defeated, I looked back toward the house, towards the study where I knew Mark kept his main laptop, the one that held the backup drive keys for all his offline storage. I had to go back inside, find the keys, try to boot the burner phone or access the main laptop, all while knowing Mark's scheduled lunch was ending soon, and 4 p.m. was rapidly approaching. As I turned to re-enter the house, my eyes caught on the calendar magnet stuck haphazardly to the side of the refrigerator, the one he'd insisted on keeping, the one that showed all his appointments in color-coded marker. Today, Wednesday, was marked in bright red, dry cleaning pickup, suit for flight, and written underneath in tiny script, an annotation I had never noticed before. Tailor confirmed. Suit lining modified for passport drop. The modification to the suit lining. It wasn't just a quick trip to the dry cleaner. It was a final physical preparation for departure, designed to bypass standard security checks for small, critical items. If he was picking up the suit today, he already had the passport, the transfer codes, or both, hidden within the very fabric of the attire he planned to wear when he shook hands with the pilot. I looked at the clock again. 12:45 p.m. I had 3 hours and 15 minutes before the plane was scheduled to taxi. The dead burner phone felt like a lead weight in my hand, a symbol of my near miss. I couldn't waste time trying to revive it. I had to secure the evidence in Mark's study, which meant going back into the lion's den, and I had to do it silently. I slipped back into the house, moving through the entryway like a shadow. My goal was the leather briefcase he had left on the hall table. It was locked, of course, but Mark, in his overconfidence, always used the same type of antique brass combination lock on his expensive luggage, a sentimental weakness I knew how to exploit. He'd shown me once, bragging that no digital security mattered if you respected classic mechanics. I knelt by the briefcase, my fingers finding the cool metal dial. I whispered the combination. The year we bought our first house, a number so personal he probably never considered it a security risk. Click, click. The latch popped open with a soft, familiar sigh. Inside, nestled beneath piles of standard contracts, was a small, heavily padded envelope. It wasn't addressed, but the paper felt thick, brittle. I tore it open. It wasn't filled with passports or cash. It was filled with documents, but not the kind I expected. These were original physical paper certificates, bearer bonds issued decades ago, long forgotten in the modern digital age, incredibly difficult to trace, and redeemable only with physical possession. There must have been $10 million in face value minimum tucked away as a true last resort escape fund. And tucked inside the sheaf of bonds was a single, handwritten note on heavy, cream-colored stationery, clearly not from a corporate printer. It was written in a looping, elegant script I vaguely recognized from old family correspondence. The note read, "Mark, you have confirmed receipt of the initial disbursement. The final accounting will be handled once the merger goes through as planned. Your family's cooperation in this matter is appreciated. Remember what your father promised if you failed to secure the assets. We are watching." My hands trembled so violently I nearly dropped the bonds. Your father promised. This wasn't just Mark's greed or a bad business deal gone sideways. This was a legacy move, a clandestine operation involving his family, stretching back years, perhaps even predating my marriage to him. He wasn't just running from the SEC, he was running from an obligation, or perhaps running to a dark obligation that involved generational wealth and veiled threats. The implication was staggering. Mark hadn't just decided to embezzle. He had been coerced or initiated into this scheme long ago, and the Chimera acquisition was the trigger point for a pre-arranged cash-out. I shoved the bonds and the note back into the envelope, resealing it as best I could, and placed it back in the briefcase. If I took it now, he would know instantly, and the 4 p.m. flight would turn into an immediate sprint. I needed him to get to the airport, to board the plane, believing he had successfully secured his freedom and his fortune. I needed him to think I hadn't seen anything. I heard the distinctive sound of a key turning in the lock downstairs, the sound of his car pulling into the garage. Mark was early. He must have rushed back from his lunch meeting, perhaps to grab a forgotten item or to verify the transfer before heading to the tailor. I slammed the study door shut just as I heard his footsteps climbing the main staircase, quick and purposeful. I had mere seconds. I ducked into the large walk-in linen closet adjacent to the hallway, pulling the heavy oak door closed just as Mark reached the top step. I held my breath, pressing my ear against the wood. I could hear him moving directly outside, his heavy leather shoes pacing on the hardwood floor, stopping right outside the study door, then moving toward the closet. He wasn't looking for me yet. He was making a final sweep. Then I heard the unmistakable sound of the briefcase latch being opened again. He was checking his bearer bonds. A moment of silence stretched into an eternity, then a low, frustrated curse. "Damn it," he muttered, his voice muffled but clear. "Where is the note? I specifically remember putting the instruction note back in here after I confirmed the transfer initiated. Clara," he called out, his voice smooth but with a tight, dangerous edge. "Clara, are you home? I need that linen insurance policy from your filing cabinet, the one about the house." He was lying. He knew I hadn't been near the filing cabinet. He was using an innocuous question as a lure. I didn't move, didn't breathe. I heard him walk away from the closet back toward the study. Then silence again, broken only by the distant, faint whirring sound of the garage door starting to open. He must have triggered it remotely. Suddenly, the closet door handle rattled violently. Not a smooth turn, but a desperate, shaking pull. He was frantic now. He didn't believe I was gone. "Clara, this isn't a game. If you're hiding in here, get out. I need the key to the deposit box, and I need it now, or I swear the consequences for both of us will be catastrophic." I squeezed my eyes shut. If he found me, he would overpower me and take the evidence I hadn't secured. But if I stayed hidden, he would leave with the bearer bonds, and I would be left here to face the fallout alone, without the only leverage I possessed. I had to make a move. With a surge of adrenaline, I threw the closet door open directly into his chest. Mark stumbled back with a surprised grunt, dropping the envelope he was clutching, the one containing the bearer bonds and the threat from his father. The envelope fluttered open in the air currents, the crisp white certificate snowing down around us onto the hallway rug, the handwritten note drifting toward the top of the stairs. Before either of us could react, before he could grab the bonds or I could secure the note, the garage door downstairs slammed shut with an unnatural finality, and a deep, rumbling engine sound echoed up through the floorboards. Not the sound of his sedan, but the unmistakable heavy roar of a jet engine spooling up for immediate takeoff. Mark looked past me, his eyes wide with sheer terror, not at me, but toward the sound. "No!" he screamed, scrambling past me toward the stairs. "They're early. Ricardo moved the flight up. The SEC must have leaked the investigation already. We're out of time." He didn't stop to pick up the scattered bonds or the threatening note now caught halfway down the stairs. He launched himself down the steps, pulling his phone out, frantically redialing the number from the burner text, clearly attempting to call the pilot. I stood frozen in the doorway, watching him vanish down the stairs, realizing that by the time I managed to descend and grab the evidence, the plane, and Mark's escape, would already be lifting off the tarmac. The sound of the jet engine was a physical vibration through the house, a terrifying soundtrack to Mark's complete unraveling. He hit the bottom step, his focus entirely on the small, dark phone pressed to his ear. "Ricardo, what the hell are you doing? Hold the position. I need 5 minutes. I'm on my way." His voice was shrill, stripped of all polish. He wasn't trying to negotiate. He was begging. I realized with a sickening jolt that the jet roar I was hearing wasn't the main engine spooling up for takeoff. It was the ground crew running the auxiliary power units, preparing for immediate departure, perhaps signaling a catastrophic system failure or a sudden regulatory intervention that had forced their timeline forward by hours. The SEC hadn't just started an investigation. They were moving with unprecedented speed, forcing the culprits to abandon their carefully planned exit. I looked down at the hallway rug. The bearer bonds were scattered like fallen autumn leaves, millions of dollars of untraceable wealth lying there for anyone to claim. But the handwritten note, the one hinting at his father's control and the generational obligation, was halfway down the stairs, caught near the edge of the runner, fluttering gently in the draft, created by the rapid air exchange in the house. I bolted down the stairs, ignoring Mark's furious, unheard conversation into the phone. I snatched the note, my fingers closing around the thick paper, just as Mark ripped the phone from his ear, his face a mask of defeated horror. "They won't hold it," he whispered, staring blindly at the garage door. "Ricardo said the airspace is being locked down by federal authorities. He saw the news trucks mobilizing near the perimeter." Federal authorities. The SEC wasn't just sending a freezing order. They were physically present. This meant my anonymous tip, or perhaps the preliminary findings I'd seen, had triggered an immediate physical response. My premonition hadn't just saved us from financial ruin, it had inserted me into the middle of an active federal sting operation. Mark finally looked at me, truly seeing me, standing there amidst the chaos, clutching the single piece of paper that confirmed his treason. His eyes hardened, the desperation snapping back into dangerous calculation. "Clara," he said, his voice dangerously level, "you saw that? You shouldn't have looked." He took a slow step toward me. He was larger, stronger, and fueled by the sheer panic of a man about to lose everything, including his freedom. I backed up toward the front entrance, my hand reaching instinctively for the heavy brass letter opener I kept on the hall table, the one shaped like a miniature rapier. "It's over, Mark," I managed, my voice shaking but holding firm. "The bonds are here. The note is here. You were leaving me to take the fall." He stopped, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. "The bonds, yes. Thank you for picking them up, darling. That saves me a trip back up those stairs. Now, hand them over, and the note. I still have one contingency, a final phone call that can make all of this disappear." He lunged, not for me, but for the pile of bonds on the rug near his feet. As he bent over, I seized the opportunity. I didn't grab the bonds. I grabbed the note, the one detailing his father's involvement, and spun around, aiming for the only exit that didn't lead directly back to the garage and whatever federal lockdown was unfolding there, the back door leading to the secluded garden path. I burst through the door and ran. The cool afternoon air was a shock against my skin, but I didn't slow down. I could hear Mark behind me, his expensive shoes slipping on the flagstones as he chased me across the patio. "Clara, stop! That note implicates people you don't understand. You run with that. You put a target on your own head," he yelled, his voice cracking with real fear now, a fear that finally seemed to eclipse his greed. I didn't look back. I scrambled over the low stone wall separating our property from the dense, unkempt woodland that backed onto the neighborhood. The woods were my sanctuary. I knew the small, hidden trails better than anyone. I plunged into the undergrowth, the crisp paper clutched tightly in one hand, the flimsy letter opener in the other. Mark hesitated at the wall. He hated getting his tailored suits dirty. That moment of hesitation bought me precious seconds. I crashed deeper into the trees, heading toward the abandoned old firebreak trail I used for long runs. I could hear him crashing through the brush behind me now, closer than I liked, spurred on by the realization that the note was the key to his survival, or his destruction. I rounded a massive oak tree, expecting to see him immediately behind me, but instead I slammed directly into another figure, emerging from the opposite direction. This figure was silent, broad, and wearing dark, nondescript clothing. Not a jogger, not a neighbor. He moved with professional efficiency, cutting off my path entirely. He didn't shout. He simply raised a heavy hand, and in the dim light filtering through the canopy, I saw the metallic glint of something small and serious, held loosely in his other hand. Before I could scream, before Mark could burst through the foliage right behind me, the silent man grabbed my wrist, his grip instantly paralyzing. And then, from behind me, Mark let out a strangled cry. But it wasn't a cry of anger or pursuit. It was a sound of pure, agonizing realization. "No, not you. I paid you off last month. You were supposed to be in Singapore," Mark shrieked from the edge of the clearing. The silent man merely glanced over his shoulder at Mark, a look of cold dismissal on his face, then tightened his grip on me, forcefully pulling the note from my grasp. As the man pocketed the paper, he spoke for the first time, his voice gravelly and low, directed not at me but at the terrified Mark. "The arrangement changed, Mr. Davies. Your father sends his regards, and he said, 'Clara stays with us.'" The world tilted. The silence of the woods was shattered by Mark's final, desperate plea, a sound so pathetic it almost drowned out the rising chorus of approaching sirens, the heavy, definitive wail of law enforcement converging on our property from multiple directions, alerted by an anonymous tipster who was clearly more than just a worried wife. "You said I just needed to secure the assets. You guaranteed my exit. He gave me his word." Mark was arguing with the shadow, the man who had just intercepted me, the man who was supposed to be miles away in Asia. This wasn't Mark's crisis anymore. It was his family's deeply entrenched dirty laundry finally being aired in the most public way possible. The silent operative, Ricardo, I realized with a fresh wave of icy dread, the same man mentioned in Mark's doom text, didn't dignify Mark's outburst with a response. He simply looked down at me, his eyes flat and unreadable. He had the note, the physical proof of the generational conspiracy, and he had me, the loose end who had stumbled upon the entire mechanism. "Let me go," I said, my voice surprisingly steady despite the adrenaline surge. I focused on the sirens now growing louder, realizing they were my only lifeline. "The SEC is here. You can't move anything or anyone out of here without being intercepted. You know that." Ricardo actually managed a faint, almost professional smirk. "The SEC is interested in Mr. Davies and the Chimera fraud. They are not currently interested in the legacy holdings, which is what that note confirms. They are also not interested in domestic disturbances. He tugged me firmly toward the deeper woods, away from the sounds of the raid. You, however, are a problem, a distraction from the primary target. Mark, seeing his carefully laid escape plan dissolve into the sound of police choppers overhead, made one last futile dash toward us, not to save me, but to silence the witness who held the key to implicating his father. Clara, if you walk out of here with that information, you destroy generations. Think about what you're doing, he screamed, grabbing desperately at the operative's shoulder. Ricardo reacted with practiced economy. He didn't fight Mark. He simply shifted his weight, using Mark's momentum against him. He shoved Mark backward, sending him sprawling hard onto the unforgiving ground near the stone wall, right into the path of the first two plainclothes officers who burst through the boundary hedge, drawn by the sound of shouting. "There he is! Stop him!" one officer yelled, instantly recognizing the man identified in the federal alert as the primary architect of the pending collapse. Mark didn't resist the arresting officers. He didn't fight the handcuffs. He simply looked over the officer's shoulder, directly at me, his face etched with a final, crushing realization. He was being arrested for fraud, but his father's organization was surviving, untouched because Ricardo had secured the leverage note. He was ruined, but his family's legacy was safe. For now. Ricardo dragged me deeper into the shadows, pulling me off the main trail toward a barely visible deer path that led down toward the creek bed, an escape route that would take us miles away from the immediate police perimeter. "You made a very poor choice, Mrs. Davies," Ricardo murmured, pulling a compact satellite phone from his tactical vest. "You could have stayed home, collected a respectable settlement, and lived comfortably in ignorance. Instead, you intervened." "You work for his father," I stated, no longer asking but confirming the terrifying truth. "You're going to dispose of me to protect the old man's scheme." Ricardo paused his dialing, looking genuinely surprised by my directness. "Dispose of you? No, that creates too much noise, and your husband's associates are already under federal review. We don't eliminate witnesses publicly anymore. That draws the wrong kind of attention. We simply discredit them." He brought the satellite phone to his ear. I knew that call was going to be the final nail in my coffin, a call to a lawyer, a PR firm, or perhaps even a controlled leak to the media that would paint me as the unstable, vindictive wife who fabricated evidence to ruin her successful husband. But as Ricardo opened his mouth to speak, I saw something I'd missed in the panic of the chase. The faint, nearly invisible scar tissue running along the inside of his left forearm just above his wrist, a scar identical to the faded line on the antique map I had spent 6 months restoring last year. That map, supposedly a rare 17th century Dutch charting of the East Indies trade routes, had a subtle, expertly hidden imperfection in the cartography, a tiny, deliberate distortion in the longitude lines near Batavia. I remembered the restoration notes I'd taken, the meticulous measurements that proved the distortion was not accidental age or damage, but an intentional marker. I had cataloged that specific geographic error as the signature of a long-disbanded, near-mythical group of privateers, the very same group whose crest I had seen faintly watermarked beneath the seal on the cryptic note from Mark's briefcase. I didn't have the letter opener anymore, but I had knowledge. "Batavia, 1688, I said sharply, interrupting the operative mid-dial. Ricardo froze, his thumb hovering over the send button. The shock was immediate and profound, replacing his professional composure with pure, unadulterated alarm. He lowered the phone, staring at me as if I had just materialized from thin air. "How do you know that designation?" he hissed, dropping my arm. "The map," I breathed, tasting victory mixed with terror. "The one you authenticated for the exchange in Zurich last spring. The one that showed the coastal shift just south of Java. You marked it, didn't you? You used the coordinates as a key." Ricardo stared at me, breathing heavily, caught in a web spun not by financial spreadsheets, but by antique ink and centuries-old secrets. He was part of something far older and deeper than Mark's venture capital fraud. He had been relying on my ignorance as a librarian to keep my mouth shut. He slowly brought the satellite phone back to his mouth, but instead of making a call, he pressed a single button, sending a short, coded burst of static. He looked back at me, his face now grim. "The game has changed, Mrs. Davies. You're no longer just a distraction. You are now a liability to the entire operation, and my instructions just changed from discredit to contain." Before I could process what contain meant, a heavy net, previously concealed high in the canopy above the deer path, dropped with terrifying speed and accuracy, wrapping around me before I could move a muscle, plunging me into total, suffocating darkness.